May 27, 1864. In the woods surrounding a small grist mill 27 miles from Atlanta, the Union Army, led by General William T. Sherman, suffered a devastating defeat. For more than 3 weeks, they had been advancing steadily across northern Georgia. Their target, Atlanta. Buoyed by a string of recent victories, they headed confidently toward the city that served as a vital railroad and manufacturing center for the Confederacy. But late on the afternoon of May 27th, in a bloody battle that lasted only a few hours, they lost more than 1,600 men. Confederate casualties numbered fewer than 500. It was a humiliating loss for the Union forces. And after the war, General Sherman ignored the Battle of Pickett's Mill in both his official reports and his personal memoirs. But the soldiers who fought here remembered. One Confederate lieutenant, writing a letter home, described the devastation he witnessed on the battlefield. "Daylight," he said, "revealed a sight on that hillside that was sickening to look upon. All along in front of the center and left of our brigade, the ground was literally covered with dead men. To look upon this, and then the beautiful wild woods, the pretty flowers as they drank in the morning dew, and listen to the sweet notes of the songsters in God's first temples, we were constrained to say, what is man and his destiny to do such a strange thing?" By the spring of 1864, the Civil War was well into its 3rd year. More than 500,000 men had died, and thousands more had been wounded. With no end in sight, the war seemed as if it would drag on forever. As spring gave way to the heat of an early southern summer, Sherman led 3 federal armies south from Chattanooga. Under a blistering Georgia sun, more than 100,000 soldiers invaded the state, setting into motion a plan that General Ulysses S. Grant had formulated 2 months earlier. Sherman's objective was Atlanta. Atlanta was the heart of the Confederate war effort, and before the North could win the war, it had to fall. As Sherman's army advanced along the route of the Western and Atlantic Railroad, they were blocked at almost every turn by the Confederate Army of Tennessee, commanded by General Joseph E. Johnston. But Sherman repeatedly attacked and flanked, forcing Johnston to withdraw from every stronghold he established. In just 2 weeks, the Union Army covered more than half the distance to Atlanta. In mid-May, Johnston fell back to Allatoona Pass, where the Western and Atlantic Railroad ran through a gap in the Allatoona Mountains. Entrenched in this natural fortress, Johnston waited for Sherman to attack. But Sherman understood the strength of the Confederate position. Instead of risking a direct assault, he ordered his troops to cut loose from their supply line along the railroad. Loaded with enough supplies for 20 days, they set off into the countryside. They headed for Dallas, a little crossroads town 22 miles to the south. From Dallas, they would be able to either move east to rejoin the railroad or head directly for Atlanta. The confident Sherman wired his chief quartermaster back in Nashville, "We are now all in motion like a vast hive of bees and expect to swarm along the Chattahoochee in 5 days." But he was unprepared for the rugged conditions around the Etowah River. Few maps of the region existed, and in places, the woods were so thick they were nearly impenetrable. It took 2 days just to get within striking distance of Dallas. 2 days which gave Johnston time to detect the Federal movements. Johnston moved his entire army to the southwest, where he established a new defensive line that extended from a mile south of Dallas to a crossroads at New Hope Church, 4 miles north of town. On May 25th, during a brutal battle at New Hope Church, the Federal forces suffered more than 1,600 casualties. Confederate losses were less than half as many men. The next day, May 26, as both sides attempted to recover from the fierce fighting, Sherman decided to move about 14,000 soldiers to Pickett's Mill, 2 miles northeast of New Hope Church. The troops set out at 10 o'clock on the morning of May 27. It was hard going, through country marked by deep ravines and steep ridges. For hours, the Union soldiers struggled through thick woods. Then, unsure of their position and unable to see through the dense foliage around them, they spent 2 full hours forming for the attack. By the time General Oliver Howard finally launched his assault late that afternoon, his men were worn out. The original Federal plan of attack called for the same kind of column formation that had been used 2 days before, with such devastating results at New Hope Church. But the confusion began even before the battle was launched. At 4:35, Howard sent a message back to his Army commander. "I am on the ridge beyond the hill that we were looking at this morning. No person can appreciate the difficulty in moving over this ground unless he can see it. I am now turning the enemy's right flank, I think." To Howard's left were several hundred of Brigadier General John P. Kelly's dismounted Confederate cavalrymen. Directly in front of him were the infantrymen of Patrick Cleburne's division, commonly regarded as the best in the Army of Tennessee. To lead the attacking columns, Howard sent in Brigadier General William B. Hazen's brigade. Almost immediately, they ran into Kelly's dismounted cavalrymen. Hazen's soldiers drove back the Confederate skirmishers and pushed ahead, moving down through a deep ravine. But as they started up the steep slope on the other side, they found not the undefended end of the Confederate line they expected, but one of Patrick Cleburne's brigades, commanded by General Hiram Granberry. Hazen's front line got within 20 paces of the enemy. But in the early confusion of the advance, 2 of his battalions had moved in the wrong direction. Instead of supporting the front line, they ended up in a cornfield to Hazen's left, where they flanked the Confederate line, moving around and behind it into the cornfield. Their unexpected change of direction brought the Federals as close as they would come to victory at Pickett's Mill. But their advantage was short-lived, and they were quickly repulsed by the Confederates. With his troops stretched across the battlefield, Hazen desperately needed help. His men, exhausted from a day of marching and fighting, had reached the limits of their endurance. Though the initial battle plan had called for them to be protected by 2 additional brigades, they had moved forward with no support. The brigade closest to them, commanded by Colonel Benjamin F. Scribner, ran into Kelly's men near the grist mill. Averted by the fierce fighting here, they were unable to reach Hazen in time to help. Had they arrived at the cornfield sooner, as the Federal plan called for, the outcome of the battle that day would certainly have been different. Hazen sent message after message asking for reinforcements, but many of his couriers were shot. Those who did return brought only bad news. Hazen finally ordered a withdrawal, but the enemy fire was so heavy that many units were unable to retreat. Lieutenant Ambrose Bierce of Hazen's staff wrote, "The battle, as a battle, was at an end, but there was still some slaughter that it was possible to incur before nightfall, and as the wreck of our brigade drifted back through the forest, we met Gibson's brigade, which, had the attack been made in column as it should have been, would have been 5 minutes behind our heels, with another 5 minutes behind its own. As it was, just 45 minutes had elapsed, during which the enemy had destroyed us and was now ready to perform the same kindly office to our successors." In those 45 minutes, Hazen's brigade had lost 500 men. Finally, almost an hour after Hazen's initial advance, Gibson's brigade moved forward. In the interim, the Confederates had improved their field works and received both reinforcements and new supplies of ammunition. The odds facing Gibson were even worse than those Hazen had faced. One of Gibson's regiments sent more than 400 men into battle and lost fully half of them. Another regiment lost 6 color bearers as one after the other, they charged into the face of enemy fire to recover the regimental flag. After the battle, one Federal soldier wrote, "This is surely not war, it is butchery." As darkness approached on the evening of May 27, the Federals decided that further assaults were futile, but many of their dead and wounded lay along the hillsides and in the ravine near the Confederate line. In an attempt to rescue them, Howard's last brigade moved forward, not to attack the Confederates anew, but simply to hold the Federal line while the wounded were rescued. 2 hours after Hazen had initiated his assault, the 3rd Federal Brigade, commanded by Colonel Frederick Neffler, finally advanced through the ravine. After sundown, the firing gradually subsided, but barely 100 yards separated the two sides. And at such close quarters, neither side could get the rest they so desperately needed. So at 10 o'clock that night, one of Cleburne's brigades attacked and pushed back the Federal line. General Cleburne, describing the battle, wrote, "It needed but the brilliancy of this night attack to add luster to the achievements of Granbury and his brigade in the afternoon." When the fighting was over, one Confederate captain gave his account of the devastation on the battlefield. "Dead men meet the eye in every direction, and in one place I stopped and counted 50 dead men in a circle of 30 feet of me. I have seen many dead men, and seen them wounded and crippled in various ways, have seen their limbs cut off. But I never saw anything before that made me sick, like looking at these men did. I do believe that if a soldier could be made to faint, that I would have fainted if I had not passed on and got out of that place as soon as I did." In all, the Union forces lost more than 1,600 men in the fighting around Pickett's Mill. Confederate casualties that day numbered fewer than 500. It was an embarrassing defeat for the Union Army. After the war, Ambrose Bierce wrote that the abortive assault at Pickett's Mill belonged to those events that are, by their very nature, foredoomed to oblivion. By the following day, the weary Union forces had received new supplies of ammunition as well as artillery. They fought a fierce battle at Dallas, during which they turned the tables on the Confederates once again. The Southern forces lost more than 600 men that day, while the Federals reported losses of only 379. For the next week, there was constant skirmishing and sniping along the line at Pickett's Mill. Finally, on the night of June 4, Johnston ordered a full withdrawal, and Sherman's men moved in to occupy the deserted Confederate line. They pushed ahead toward Atlanta, but by the end of June, the Union Army still hadn't crossed the Chattahoochee River. They continued their strategy of attacking and flanking, fighting major battles at Kennesaw Mountain and Smyrna. Finally, on July 8, the leading edge of Sherman's army crossed the Chattahoochee. 3 days later, the general wired Washington, "We now commence the real game for Atlanta." But it was 6 more weeks before Atlanta fell. Sherman refused to risk a direct attack against the city because, as he wrote, Atlanta presented a bold front at all points, with fortified lines that defied a direct assault. Since he lacked the troops to surround the city and lay siege to it, he instead sent his armies south to try to cut the Confederacy's last remaining rail link with the outside world. When the Confederates lost the Battle of Jonesboro, they lost their hold on the Macon and Western Railroad. Atlanta no longer had access to the outside world, and after enduring weeks of shelling, the city finally surrendered on September 2nd. After 4 months of almost constant fighting and the loss of nearly 70,000 Confederate and Union soldiers, the Atlanta campaign was over. But for Sherman, the victory in Atlanta was only the beginning. On November 15, he began his march to the sea through Georgia. By Christmas, he had reached Savannah. With that city's surrender, Sherman cut the Confederacy in half and succeeded with a campaign that he had so rightly predicted would sound the death knell of the Southern Confederacy.